Good afternoon and welcome. My name is George Beck, and I'm chair of Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections. And we're a co-sponsor of Hedrick Smith's talk today, along with American Promise. American Promise's state director is here. She is Vicki Barnes, and she's right over there. You'll notice that we have tables set up at the entrance. Please take materials, and if you sign in, we'll put your name on our mailing list, and you can follow our efforts to restore democracy in this country. Today's presentation is free. Nonetheless, we have provided a free will offering at the door as you enter. I have an idea that after you hear what Hedrick has to say, you may want to contribute something. Lori Sturdevant is going to introduce Hedrick this afternoon. I'm sure you're all familiar with her, but she has been a reporter and a columnist for the Star Tribune since 1976 and joined the editorial staff in 1992. She has recently failed retirement and is once again occasionally writing a column for the Star Tribune. She has, in her spare time, authored or co-authored 11 books, the most recent of which is When Republicans Were Progressive, with former Senator Dave Durenberger. Lori Sturdevant.
Well, thank you, George, and what a good crowd today. I guess I'm surprised, George, but maybe not so surprised. As George kindly mentioned, I've been running around the state a bit with former Senator Dave Durenberger talking about our new book, When Republicans Were Progressive, and we, too, have been experiencing good-sized crowds, folks who want to not just trip down memory lane with us, but who want to talk about their concerns about the state of American democracy, and we see if there are some ideas from the past and some ideas that he and I favor in the present that might do us some good. Jean Massey's here from Fair Vote, and Jean, you might be interested to know that when we talk about ranked choice voting as one of our favorite remedies, heads nod, not just in the Twin Cities where we're familiar with it in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, but also in places like Brainerd and Nisswa and Owatonna. People are expressing interest. Even in Duluth, where the idea went down in a referendum a few years ago, I heard the mayor say we'd like to bring it back. Concern about the state of our democracy is driving this. Redistricting reform is an idea we talk about, and people are aware that Minnesota's luck on redistricting could run out in 2021, our luck being that we've had divided state legislatures and governors just enough, at just the appropriate intervals, so that judges, rather than the politicians themselves, the legislators themselves, have drawn our district lines 5 out of the last 6 times we've had to redistrict. But if we have all one-party rule in 2021, and some folks think that sounds like a pretty good idea, maybe on some policy fronts it does, but it does give a chance for some gerrymandering that we haven't seen in Minnesota, so there's interest in that. Oh, and there's interest in electoral college reform among Minnesotans increasingly. It's become a partisan issue, some with increasingly Democrats, for understandable national reasons, interested in electoral college reform, and Republicans a bit less so. People will ask me what I think, and I ask, is the current electoral college sustainable in this country? What will happen if we become, to this country, if presidents keep being elected by a minority of the voters, not just by a 3 million vote minority, as was the case in 2016, but maybe larger than that, maybe 5 million or even 10. And then what if the fastest growing and the most economically healthy part of the country is denied fair representation? What do we think the response will be? These are the kinds of questions that give people pause. Campaign finance reform is on people's minds too, and Hedrick, we're looking for a way to crack that nut. I hope you have brought us some ideas. Minnesotans thought we had campaign finance reform kind of fixed in 1975 after the Watergate years. We had a nation-leading public campaign funding system that just about every legislator and legislative candidate subscribed to. It's now been swamped into near irrelevance by the independent expenditures that have been turned loose, especially after Citizens United. Now, Minnesota Hedrick continues to be a place that cares about its democracy, and you can tell that by today's turnout, but also by our high voter turnout. In 8 of the last 9 presidential elections, Minnesota led the nation in voter turnout. And the turnout in 2018, 64.25%, nation leading again. Another sign that Minnesota voters are engaged and mobilized and ready, open to change, and eager to hear from Hedrick Smith today. So it's a real honor to be able to introduce you. In my profession, Hedrick Smith is a leading light. He is one of the names that commands universal respect. Like me, Hedrick Smith is a lifelong journalist, but he's got a few years on me. His beat was larger than mine. He covered the world during his 26 years at the New York Times with stories that carried datelines from such places as Saigon and Cairo, Paris, and Moscow. Then he became the New York Times' bureau chief in Washington. He won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. That's the most coveted mark of excellence in journalism. One as part of the New York Times' Pentagon Papers story in 1971, and one for international coverage. Hedrick Smith then switched mediums and became an Emmy award-winning documentary journalist for the PBS program Frontline. Along the way, he wrote 5 books and contributed to a few more. The most recent is the most cogent analysis I have found of the erosion of the American middle class. It's Who Stole the American Dream, published in 2012. Smith is the kind of journalist who's always probing, looking deeper. He seeks not only to understand some of the nation's most vexing problems, but also to shine a light on potential solutions. Maybe you missed your calling as an editorial writer. I can say with confidence that Minnesotans are lucky to have Hedrick Smith pay us a visit this week. This is the first of several appearances he will make in this state. And that this group of citizens, Hedrick, is eager to hear your perspective and learn the guidance that you are providing Americans at this point in our history. So Hedrick, welcome to Minnesota, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Lori, and thank you all for being here. It's a treat to be in Minnesota, to be with friends, to feel as though I happen to have a sister-in-law who comes from Edina. My brother married her some years ago out here, and we came out to celebrate, so I feel as though I'm sort of in the family home, back with family here. But also because Minnesota has, for so many decades, been a beacon of good government and of reform and of progressive ideas. And so it feels like this is a good place to be talking about what I call the missing story of American politics. Missing story because the story of citizen reform movements is really being ignored by the mainstream media around the country. That's my experience. I've traveled around. You get stories here and there in Minnesota or in South Dakota or in Seattle or in North Carolina or in Florida about what's going on in that state. And it's a bit of a blip, but it disappears. And you don't have any feeling that there actually is a citizen reform movement, loosely formed, but nonetheless present, vibrant, active all around the country. Lori mentioned my experience in Saigon, Cairo, Moscow. I traveled probably 30 or 40 countries as a reporter. And what I learned as a foreign correspondent is that you cannot cover a country by sitting in the capital. You cannot find out what's going on in the country. You can't feel the heartbeat, the muscle, the sinew, the activism, and the opinions of people in the nation's capital. And we have a national press corps that is absolutely wedded to the bubble inside the Beltway. And the result is that on the kind of story I'm talking about, what's going on in the country, they simply aren't getting out. They aren't hearing the story. They aren't seeing it. How many journalists in Washington, and maybe how many of you, know that 2018 was probably the most active year for citizen reform movements in the United States in the last half century. The last time we saw as much reform going on at the grassroots level in this country was the civil rights movement of the 1960s. What happened in 2018? 5 states enacted gerrymander reform based on citizen initiatives that put the vote on the ballot. Which states? Ohio, Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah. Now, those would not necessarily be the 5 first states that you would pick for reform. So these 5 states said, we don't want politicians doing the drawing of political maps anymore. They're just drawing the maps to keep themselves in office. We want somebody else doing it. We want an independent commission. We want a bipartisan action. We want it tripartisan. The commission that was set up in Michigan, the one that was set up in Colorado, there's going to be 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 4 independents. And in Michigan, it's actually going to be 5 independents. And you've got to get the backing of somebody from each of those groups for any plan. That's to ensure that one party can't dominate. Then you had Maine adopt ranked choice voting and actually use it in a congressional election. And it worked. And the whole idea is to get more people involved, but also to finally have whoever you get elected has a majority behind him or her. So the office holder is elected by a majority. In Florida, supposedly a racist electorate, there was a 64% majority for a measure, a constitutional amendment, to restore the voting rights of former felons who had served their time. And a good percentage of them, not a majority, but a good percentage of them are minority, either black or Latino. And that was something they decided to do. Public funding of campaigns was adopted in Baltimore, in Phoenix, and Portland. Half a dozen states adopted automatic voter registration when not only when you renew your driver's license, but when you interact with some state agency. Or another 7 states adopted same-day registration. You can register when you go to vote. So you don't have to go twice. So if you go once, you can do it all at the same time. These are the kinds of things that were being passed in 2018. And this is really actually a bubbling up. It's been going on for quite a while. There are 15 states that have adopted gerrymander reform. I don't see Minnesota among them. So maybe that's something you need to think about. You're protected by the judges, perhaps. And the next census is an enormously important census, 2020. And 2021, there will be another redistricting of your legislative seats as well as your congressional seats. But this is something that is actively being debated and being brooded about around the country. So what I want to do today is to show you some of the reporting I've done around the country. It kind of grew out of the book that Lori mentioned I wrote, Who Stole the American Dream? I was talking to various audiences about the inequality of income and about the stagnation of the American middle class. And I kept getting questions from people, naturally. What are we going to do about it? How do we do something about it? What do we do about the minimum wage? What do we do about job retraining? How do we help both companies and people who've been thrown out of work or had their companies collapse because of global competition? Don't we need to work with it? And you look at what Germany and Switzerland and Australia, Canada, other countries do, they do something. And the further I got into the question of what we do about economic growth and economic fairness, and I began to talk to people about climate change, and then I began to hear people talking about health care and began to hear people talking about immigration. And you look at one major issue after another in this country, and you see that over the last decade, as a country, we have not been able to deal with them. Not just resolve them, but be able to take a good bite and move forward on them. And the reason is we've got a broken political system. Fixing the political system, engaging in political reform, which has to be done almost always at the state level. That's the gateway issue to being able to deal with the larger issues. When people say, and you look at the opinion polls in America, and it goes back now the last 15 or 20 years, 70 to 80% of people say regularly in opinion polls, government in Washington has been taken over by special interests. Corporations and billionaires own our political campaigns. Lobbyists have too much power. Politicians don't, elected officials don't listen to people like me. And then I saw one poll, 91% said American democracy is broken. That's a stunning figure. And even more stunning was about 90% of that 91% said there's nothing we can do about it. Nothing we can do about it. I have a friend in the Southwest named Ernie Cortez. He's an organizer, a Latino organizer. He organizes in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. I was talking with him one day, and he said to me, you know, Rick, they say power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said powerlessness also corrupts. Powerlessness corrupts democracy at the core. This is why we're here today. This is why I want to share these stories with you. We are not powerless. We need to re-empower ourselves. We can re-empower ourselves. And what I want to do is to show you examples of people in states around this country, and not the states you would pick as the reform states, who have said, we've been sending the message to Washington for years, fix our democracy. And it hasn't happened. And finally, they're understanding that if we want it fixed, we have to do it ourselves. Let me repeat that. If we want our democracy fixed, we need to do it ourselves. We need to re-empower ourselves and take charge of our own political destiny and our own political system. Dave, let's roll the film. From the March for Our Lives,
Vote them out! Vote them out!
to the spreading teachers' walkouts, to the Women's March, Americans are fed up with Washington and rebelling against the politicians and power brokers.
I believe that we will win.
Taking their fight to the states, battling to fix our broken democracy.
We are the 99%. Money talks, baby! Money talks!
Fighting against Citizens United,
We do not believe that corporations are people.
voter suppression,
We will never stop battling.
dark money,
The money was hopping from one nonprofit to another, all for the purpose of concealing donors.
gerrymandering,
The real work on redistricting was being done behind closed doors.
winning grassroots victories,
We saw real changes in the power of lobbyists.
combating corruption with public funding,
I would not have even thought about running for state senate without this funding.
and politicians feeling cornered plot to keep themselves in power.
I was disgusted, defying the Constitution because they had been behaving that way for decades before that.
Tonight, people power winning back our democracy. 6 states, 6 rebellions, 6 stories.
Our political system can be fixed. Get out there and fix it.
Good evening, everybody. I am Rosa Nell Eaton, 92 years old. I am before you today to speak on voting rights.
7 decades ago, under Jim Crow, they made Rosanelle Eaton recite the preamble of the U.S. Constitution to qualify to vote.
Without missing a word, I did it.
Now she's in a new war, fighting against a strict voter photo ID law, a powder keg issue in many states.
I am fed up and fired up. I said fed up. Thank you so very much.
Y'all better say what Mama said. Fed up!
This is Moral Monday, a grassroots movement organized by the Reverend William Barber, an echo of the civil rights movement that won black voting rights back in the 1960s. Tensions are at fever pitch. Demonstrators occupy the state capitol, trying to stop passage of a new law that threatens black voting rights. And they get arrested by the busload. But Republicans who control state government pour on more restrictions.
Simply bring your North Carolina driver's license or identification card.
We've got a good bill. We've got a bill that ensures integrity of the voting place. It increases voter turnout and it increases voter integrity.
If we look at this bill in its totality, it's all about suppressing the vote.
See those children up there? Those children have been there for the last 3 hours with tapes around their mouths because they understand what this bill has the potential to do, which is take their voice away.
Republican supermajorities steamroll passage, and in August 2013, Governor Pat McCrory signs the tough new voting law.
The integrity of our election process is vital to our democracy, which is why I've signed today several common sense reforms into law, including voter ID.
It was not a photo ID, it was a monster, mean-spirited, manipulative, very cynical voter suppression bill, the likes of which we had not seen since Jim Crow.
Absolutely a backlash from the white Republican majority in the state legislature against what we had seen black voting strength do in previous elections.
I need you, North Carolina.
In 2008, black voters ensured that Barack Obama won North Carolina in that presidential election. Their political power was increasing.
Allison Riggs, an attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, sued the state, arguing in court that the photo ID law was unconstitutional.
We put on extensive evidence about each provision of the bill and how it would disproportionately impact voters of color. And we put on evidence that the legislature knew about those disproportionate impacts as they designed the bill. They changed the photo ID requirement to keep IDs that white voters most likely had and to get rid of the kind of IDs that black voters were more likely to have. And same thing with same-day registration, early voting, out-of-precinct voting, voting tools more likely to be used by voters of color.
Legislative leaders insisted they were fighting voter fraud.
The opportunity to commit fraud was so easy, and it would have been foolish to assume that somebody at some point, even if they had not tried it in the past, would try it in the future.
During the trial, there was no evidence of voter fraud in North Carolina presented by the state.
Instead, evidence showed that 300,000 voters were suddenly disqualified because they lacked proper state ID.
And the requirements included a birth certificate, which automatically would disenfranchise a large number of African Americans who were born in segregation by midwives or at home where birth certificates were not issued.
Now, Rosanelle Eaton, 94 years old at the time, granddaughter of a slave, a voting rights activist back in the 1960s, ran into all kinds of problems, ran into a runaround. Do you remember any of her testimony, the gist of her testimony?
Rosanelle Eaton testified at trial that it took her roughly almost a month to go through all of the hurdles necessary to change documents that had incorrectly spelled her name.
A district judge upheld the photo ID law. Then in July 2016, a 3-judge appeals court struck it down as unconstitutional, declaring that the law's provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision for partisan Republican advantage. For Moral Monday, it was a decisive victory.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Even so, the reform movement faced restricted access to early voting by Republican-controlled county election boards.
Many of the counties chose not to have Sunday voting. They chose not to have more than one site.
Stand up, fight back.
Protesters appealed to the State Board of Elections. Big cities got more polling sites. Some areas got Sunday voting for souls to the polls, marching straight from Sunday services to polling sites. But in 2018, Republican leaders got voters to pass photo ID as a constitutional amendment, with the legislature once again to write the details.
I put nothing past this legislature. History is against them, and they just can't seem to come on into the 21st century. We will never stop battling. And when we're willing to put our bodies on the line, when we're willing to dust off the Constitution and go into the courts, we can win.
Coming up,
ballot measures are about opening up our democracy and letting people have a voice again, that it matters again.
in a solid red state like South Dakota, conservative Republicans have an iron grip on power. But they've made people angry by trying to take power away from voters, and the voters are in a fighting mood. The tradition of populist rebellion dates back to 1898, when South Dakota became the first in the nation to give citizens the power to overrule politicians through popular ballot initiatives.
You know, you just go in, all the candidates will be listed on a single ballot.
And so here in Sioux Falls, reformers take their fight directly to the voters.
You know, it takes control away from the parties, gives it back to the voters.
So I'm running for the Senate, but I ain't a big wheel.
In 2014, Rick Weiland ran for the U.S. Senate as a Democrat, campaigning on getting money out of politics. Weiland lost, but a ballot measure to raise the minimum wage won a solid majority.
Ballot measures are about opening up our democracy and letting people have a voice again, getting people to believe that it matters again.
Weiland teamed up with his friend Dre Samuelson to form TakeItBack.org, a citizens movement to take on South Dakota's power brokers. After 28 years in Washington as a Democratic Capitol Hill staffer, Samuelson had given up on D.C. and come back home to push for reforms.
People are turning to ballot initiatives simply because they have no other place to turn.
They stitched together an unlikely coalition of South Dakotans across the political spectrum, including Sioux Falls' former Republican Mayor Rick Noby, now an independent.
We don't suffer from gridlock, we suffer from one-party domination.
With only 47% of the registered voters, Republicans hold every major state office and 85% of legislative seats.
The folks are angry, and justifiably so.
News reports of serious corruption in state government angered many South Dakota voters, like Alan Brummer.
They say that South Dakota's is the fifth most corrupt government in the country. Now, you know, there's one category we don't want to be up toward the top.
With help from national reform groups, Weiland and Samuelson collected more than 20,000 signatures to put an anti-corruption measure, IM-22, on the 2016 ballot. The sweeping reform called for limiting campaign contributions, greater exposure of funders, and giving every registered voter $100 in vouchers to donate to state candidates of their choice. As expected, the state's Republican powers, Governor Dennis Dugard and U.S. Senators John Thune and Mike Rounds, came out against IM-22. But the heavy opposition artillery came from the powerful political network funded by conservative billionaire activists Charles and David Koch and their flagship group Americans for Prosperity, who bankroled attack ads and mailers.
Koch brothers aren't coming in to South Dakota for any reason other than they see this as a very significant fight and they want to be sure that they nip this in the bud before it spreads.
Despite the odds against them, reformers rode a wave of anti-establishment anger and won a surprising 52% majority for the anti-corruption measure. The reformers had caught the Republican establishment off guard.
Some folks got concerned and said, "Mickelson, have you read this?" I said, "No, but I will."
Mark Mickelson is Speaker of the state legislature and South Dakota political royalty. Both his father and grandfather were governors.
Initiated Measure 22 is 13,000 words, 35 pages, amending South Dakota statute. There were some problems with it.
But under South Dakota law, voters have the final say, or so everyone thought. Lawmakers, alarmed by reforms that would help challengers, turned against their own constituents.
I've had private conversations with many of you that said, if we don't repeal this, I'm resigning.
South Dakota voters did not fully understand what they were voting for.
In an unprecedented move, the legislature called a state of emergency and by a party line majority vetoed IM-22 and simply rejected the will of the people.
When you have supermajorities in both houses and you control the governorship and every statewide elected office, you don't have to listen to the voters.
The people and the politicians clashed again in November with rival ballot initiatives. Neither side got all it wanted. The Republican speaker failed to block future citizens' initiatives, but he made them harder to pass. Reformers came close to passing a new ethics and anti-corruption measure, but they fell short of the needed majority. Now they're already gearing up for the next round.
It's the system that's the problem. It's not the people. It's this. We have to change the system.
This legislature, with 85% of Republicans, want to make it more difficult to do that. That just is wrong, and we're going to fight it tooth and nail.
Coming up.
You could clearly see that the money was intentionally hopping from one nonprofit to another, all for the purpose of concealing donors.
How are Sacramento politicians selling Prop 30?
Most American election campaigns wind up with a barrage of negative ads.
There's no in-between.
Like this one in California, blasting Governor Jerry Brown's ballot proposal in 2012 for a tax increase to fund education. The fine print names the California Small Business Action Committee as sponsor, but voters are left in the dark about who actually forked up the money. It's dark money, and it's a huge problem in all 50 states. California fights dark money by requiring financial disclosure. So Common Cause activist Derek Cressman, checking an official state website, spots a sudden flood of out-of-state dark money.
We saw this contribution of $11 million, a huge amount, coming in from this group in Arizona.
The money came from a group called Americans for Responsible Leadership, never before active in California politics. But who's this group fronting for? Anonymous contributions are prohibited in California. So Common Cause files a complaint with California's election watchdog, the Fair Political Practices Commission.
And we asked them for a formal investigation.
Commission officials are stunned.
Our reaction was just shocked at how large the $11 million contribution was.
Because it was the largest anonymous contribution ever in a campaign in California.
Commission Chair Ann Ravel is a new kind of sheriff. She wants fast action.
My immediate reaction, yes, it was absolutely, we have to jump on it.
We felt it was incredibly important to make sure that the public had the knowledge before Election Day of who was contributing that money.
And the reason is that ballot measures are complicated, and knowing who's behind it, it's like a voting queue. For some people, they have voting queues whether they're going to vote for Republicans or Democrats for candidates. But for ballot measures, knowing who's funding them or who's behind it, those are voting queues.
But the time crunch is acute, less than 3 weeks to Election Day.
We contacted the Arizona nonprofit. We got a call back from a major Washington, D.C. law firm. And truthfully, that raised our suspicion even more. Because this little nonprofit in Arizona had this big-time Washington law firm representing it.
The lawyer was Jason Torchinsky.
At 36, Torchinsky was already a Top Gun attorney on campaign law for big-name Republicans. Winnick tells Torchinsky that California law requires the Arizona group to reveal its funders, but Torchinsky resists. So you get a stonewall from these guys, and you see this guy Torchinsky is connected with a lot of high-powered Republicans. What's your reaction?
My feeling was, we need to take them to court right then.
At Sacramento Superior Court, Winnick and Torchinsky clash head to head.
The purpose of the FPPC, Your Honor, is to enforce the law even-handedly, not to railroad someone into forcing disclosure.
So he and I both showed up in court. We were saying, if you want to boil it down to its essence, give us the records. Their response, in essence, was, you're not entitled to the records.
The judge orders the Arizona group to reveal its records within 24 hours. Torchinsky appeals to a higher court, forcing delay with time running out.
The clock is ticking and the respondents are doing everything they can do to stall.
Ravel decides on an emergency appeal to the state Supreme Court. It's the weekend before Election Day. Unless the court acts, voters will go to the polls still in the dark.
The court met on Sunday by telephone, and they decided unanimously that Americans for Responsible Leadership had to submit to an audit of the FPPC by 4 o'clock that day.
So we get on a call Sunday night, 11:30, probably East Coast time. And so we get into a kind of heated discussion about what they're actually going to provide us. Let me say that on Monday morning, I had absolutely no idea what was going to be delivered to me.
Monday a.m., the dark money network comes out of the shadows, makes a series of revelations. Americans for Responsible Leadership reveals that it got $11 million from the Center to Protect Patient Rights. And the center reveals that it got $11 million from Americans for Job Security. But the original donors are still a question mark. One stunning disclosure: these groups that were funneling money from one to another were part of the political network of Kansas billionaires Charles and David Koch.
These groups had ties to a fellow named Sean Noble, who was sort of an operative of theirs and knew how to move dark money around.
You could clearly see that the money was intentionally hopping from one nonprofit to another, all with names that mean nothing to anyone and no real charitable purpose, all for the purpose of concealing donors.
Winnick had stumbled into what Governor Brown calls a money laundering operation.
They had to launder this stuff 5 times. It was so dirty, and it still stinks.
Election day, the dark money side loses, but voters are still in the dark about who wrote the big checks. Armed with subpoena power after Election Day, Winnick tracks down 2 big-time California GOP operatives, Anthony Russo and Jeff Miller. They turn state's evidence, admitting they raised $29 million from rich Californians. For secrecy, they sent donations to the Koch group, Americans for Job Security, based in Virginia.
The Koch brothers network had a lot of appeal to Miller and Russo. They had a network of nonprofits all across the country. It was a great place to hide money.
It takes Winnick a year to piece the puzzle together and give voters an inside look into how dark money works.
And this is the flow chart we came up with. It went from individual donors to the Americans for Job Security to the Koch brothers network.
In October 2013, Ravel's agency lowers the boom, finding 2 Koch groups $1 million for violating California law on disclosure. And it orders the California Small Business Action Committee to cough up its $15 million in dark money.
They hid the names of the true donors.
Individual donors escape disclosure through a loophole in California law. But for the financial audit, Winnick obtains a funding list with donor names blacked out, and a Los Angeles Times reporter manages to decipher the names. The list is a shocker. Notables like Bob Fisher, chairman of the Gap, mega investor Charles Schwab, Los Angeles philanthropist Eli Broad.
The ringleader of this fundraising operation appears actually to have been Charles Schwab.
Schwab personally emailed Charles Koch asking for money and praising Sean Noble from your group for helping move the dark money. Koch loaned use of his network, but didn't contribute money. Despite her success, Ravel pushes to tighten California's disclosure law.
There were loopholes in the law that we needed to fix. And what we had to fix was the ability to audit prior to the election and the ability to really get disclosure from independent expenditure groups.
The measure passes.
In 2014, the legislature beefs up the agency's audit powers, closes loopholes, requires disclosure of the 10 top donors for any group spending over $50,000 in a California election. California's tough line against political nonprofits is a model for the country.
I think toughening the law is a deterrent and will make those committees think more carefully about what they do. Absolutely.
Coming up.
Democracy, you must fight for it or it'll slip right out of your hands.
Money talks, baby! Money talks!
Seattle. People gathering for a picnic lunch near the famous Pike Street Market. Fishmongers draw a crowd tossing salmon. It's a peaceful, sunny September day. But rebellion is brewing.
So what we're doing today is we're going to cover the market.
A band of volunteers have come to galvanize support for a statewide vote on an initiative to curb billionaire and corporate money in political campaigns, hoping to pressure Congress to take action.
Primarily, we're targeting voters that don't know about our initiative, because you know the recent polling showed 36% are undecided.
It's initiative 735.
Thank you.
We need to put the power of the vote back into the hands of the people so that the wealthy entities will no longer have a pipeline.
Linda Bach is a modern Paul Revere, awakening the popular rebellion. She collected 21,000 signatures to help put Initiative I-735 on the 2016 ballot.
I've long had the idea that I am continuing the American Revolution. Every signature I get is just another check for the Constitution and the power of we the people. Democracy, you must fight for it or it'll slip right out of your hands.
Fear that mega money is corrupting our democracy has turned average Americans like Cindy Black into reformers.
I definitely think the Supreme Court decision of Citizens United has unleashed so much money in our system that it's ceased being a democracy, and now we've turned into an oligarchy.
In the Citizens United decision in January 2010, the Supreme Court overturned a century-old ban on corporate political spending.
And ruled that corporations can spend freely now on political campaigns.
Justice John Paul Stevens dissented. Corporations, he said, have political action committees, but letting them use their vast treasury, Stevens warned, unleashes the floodgates. Stevens was prophetic. With the lid off corporations, independent campaign expenditures skyrocketed from $8 million in 2009 to $301 million in 2010 to $1.4 billion in the 2016 election.
Changing the Constitution is a big step.
In reaction to the Citizens United decision, Senate Democrats pushed for a constitutional amendment to restore the power of Congress to regulate campaign spending, but party-line Republican opposition blocked the move.
Affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Money talks, baby! Money talks!
So reformers shifted to the states. Several legislatures called on Congress to roll back Citizens United. 700 cities joined in. In Colorado and Montana, 74% bipartisan supermajorities voted against Citizens United. In Washington State, volunteer activist Cindy Black leads the charge.
I have never run a campaign before. I'm really a grassroots organizer. I was in the Air Force, I was a crew chief, and then I went to college. I was a marriage and family therapist for quite a few years, and then running my own business.
Black is the spark plug of a statewide citizen movement.
Take your country back. We're trying to get our citizens, our voters on record saying that we do not believe that corporations are people, we do not believe that money is speech, and that we think that political contributions should be regulated and made public.
But other citizen activists disagree.
I do not want to touch the First Amendment. And this
effort, I-735, seeks to restrict the freedom of speech of certain groups of people who come together to form corporations.
If our forefathers really believed that corporations were people, I think they would have put that in the Constitution, and it is nowhere to be seen.
Okay, they want to censor corporate speech. Let's think about all the things out there that are corporations. The Seattle Times, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the New York Times, CNN, Fox News. We cannot afford as a country to censor corporations engaging in free speech.
Well, I disagree, because we do not want anything to limit free speech for the press or freedom of the press, not at all. What we're talking about is limiting money in elections.
Let's give a round of applause for Spokane!
Black has a statewide network of volunteers from the Idaho border to the Pacific coast.
It's not about left or right. I don't care if you're a Democrat, Republican, or other. We just want government that represents you, not the big briefcase full of money.
But how can amateurs win without big funding? I've talked to professional politicians in the state. They say it takes $3 million to run a successful political campaign in Washington State. You don't have $3 million.
No.
So what does it take to win? We're in a big state here, Washington State.
We talk to people. That's how we're doing it. Contact, direct voter contact, person to person.
Please tell your friends and family. Okay.
You can pass an initiative with a grassroots effort with a small budget. We can do it.
And they did it. 63% of Washington state voters rejected Citizens United and unlimited corporate money in campaigns. It takes 38 states to force Congress to act on a constitutional amendment. 19 states are now on record against Citizens United. Getting 19 more is the next challenge. Coming up.
The public was fed up with corruption.
We don't see any of that money in our communities.
Bridgeport and Waterbury, mayors went to prison.
The gold dome of Connecticut's dignified state capitol is an emblem of the Gilded Age, a symbol of the traditional power and influence of a wealthy elite. But poorer neighborhoods in Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport lacked a clear voice in state politics. All that changed a decade ago in 2008, when Connecticut implemented public financing for state elections, one of 4 states using this model reform. Suddenly, new people could run for office, like Navy veteran Gary Winfield, now a state senator from New Haven.
I could not have run under the old system of financing campaigns. I just couldn't have raised enough money to compete with an incumbent.
Or Senator Marilyn Moore, who runs a nonprofit in Bridgeport helping African American breast cancer patients.
I'm a person from a low-income community who had children very young, who did depend on food stamps for a while. I would not have even thought about running for state senate without this funding.
They personify the changing face of the legislature. More women, blacks, and Hispanics. Changes triggered by the scandal-driven resignation in 2004 of third-term Republican Governor John Rowland.
I acknowledge that my poor judgment has brought us here.
Rowland was sentenced to 1 year in prison for taking $100,000 in kickbacks from state contractors.
The public was fed up with corruption. There was a sense that the state, which had prided itself on pretty clean politics, had suddenly become tainted.
Today, we begin to restore faith, integrity, and honor to our government.
As Rowland's successor, Republican Jody Rell, took her oath as governor, she called for reform.
Governor Rell wanted to ban contributions from state contractors and state lobbyists. The Democrats who controlled the General Assembly then were concerned that that would mean the loss of too much campaign revenue.
But public pressure turned the tide. The Connecticut Citizen Action Group, an alliance of 50 civic groups, pressed for sweeping reforms, tight limits on campaign donations, plus public funding of campaigns.
In order to get the legislature and the governor to embrace truly comprehensive reform, there had to be a lot of grassroots pressure on the outside. Thousands of phone calls. There were car washes for clean elections. We did all kinds of grassroots activities.
Republican Senator Len Fasano, originally a skeptic,
Governor Rell sought out senators, including myself,
became a yes vote. Reporters say both parties got dragged into reform.
Typically, the party in power, the leaders in the party in power, resist either gerrymander reform or campaign finance reform because the system is working for them. How did Connecticut break that? What moved the legislature? What moved the people who liked the system they had?
It was a moment in time where the public shaming worked, the outside pressure worked, and finally the inside game decided this was the way to go.
The final vote to overhaul campaign finance came at 2:44 this morning.
Eventually, it passed in special session. Much to everyone's surprise, we ended up with a system of public financing for legislative races and statewide races.
The reform was bold. A tight lid of $100 on all private campaign donations, including lobbyists, plus public grants from $25,000 for House races, $110,000 for Senate, up to $3 million for the governor's race, later doubled to $6 million. To qualify, candidates must first prove popular support by raising a quota of small local contributions.
$5 to $100 from individuals that live in their districts, and based on a qualifying amount, we give them public monies to run their campaigns.
After that, no more fundraising, but using public funds is voluntary, so no one knew if candidates would do it. But right away in 2008, it took off. Today, it's solid. In 2014 and 2018, 80% of legislators from both parties used public funding. In 2014, all candidates for statewide offices used it. In 2018, 3/4 did. Total cost, $12 million for legislative elections. $30 million when statewide offices are also up for election. One big surprise, taxpayers don't foot the bill.
No, there's no tax. The money that funds the Citizens Election Program comes from abandoned state properties. There's a multitude of monies that come into the state of Connecticut and then are dispersed.
What's more, says Senate Republican leader Len Fasano, campaigns are better.
I think campaigns are more issue-oriented, more focus on debates. You can have more conversations with your constituency as opposed to raising money.
Public funding forces more interaction at the grassroots.
You're balancing the budget off the lives of the poor. People are on the bottom. We don't see any of that money in our communities.
I get how people feel about people in politics, right? I get that. I've been there. It's the reason I'm here, actually.
Needing small donors to qualify, Winfield connects with everyday people.
The older woman who's living by herself, trying to struggle to get by day, who has no way of interacting with me. You have a system of public financing that changes the way that I campaign. And when I knock on her door, she tells me a story I never would have heard. And when I sit in Hartford and I remember that story, some of the policy that I create comes from that story.
So more voice for little people, less clout for big money lobbyists.
Relationships still matter, but they don't matter because of the checkbook that's in the lobbyist's breast pocket.
We saw real changes in the power of lobbyists. We saw reforms in schools to get junk food out of schools. This was the state that was the first state to pass paid sick leave, and the business industry did not have the same kind of power.
This bill addresses gun violence prevention.
It was also easier, some say, to pass tough gun control legislation after the Sandy Hook school massacre in 2012.
Groups like the NRA were not able to influence individual politicians here because they don't fund them.
Republicans complained that after the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, Democrats loosened limits on campaign spending by parties and PACs. But in 2014, when Democratic leaders suggested abolishing the entire program to save money, lawmakers in both parties rebelled.
There was an uproar. You had members who were drawing lines in the sand. We will not eviscerate the system of public financing. It's too important.
The leaders backed down, and now public funding seems embedded.
We have had a record of success through 5 election cycles at this point.
If we funded the pure method like we originally had it, I think we were a model for the country.
I think the culture has shifted. I think in Connecticut, the culture is that the public financing of campaigns is what Connecticut does.
Coming up.
The real work on redistricting was being done behind closed doors by paid political operatives. It was a double game.
Draw the line against self-serving politicians.
Florida, February 2010. Grassroots reformers target partisan gerrymandering, a hot issue now in many states.
We don't let foxes guard hen houses or let bank robbers protect banks, but we let politicians draw their own district lines.
In Tallahassee, Republican lawmakers are out to squelch reform.
So it's impossible?
May I finish the answer?
They're grilling Ellen Frieden, leader of Fair Districts Florida, the citizen reform movement.
Let's make one thing clear when we start. Florida is one of the most politically gerrymandered states in the Union.
It's the people versus the politicians.
I represent all the people in Florida who really want to see the partisanship in redistricting stopped.
Reformers want to amend the Florida Constitution to bar politicians from rigging election districts with the intent of keeping themselves in power.
Ms. Frieden, with all due respect, the word intent, the actual intent could only be determined by a court, could it not, as a matter of law?
No, I think that the intent starts with you.
Lawmakers questioned Frieden for hours, nitpicking comments she'd made to the media.
So can you tell me that you disavow those statements?
I believe that my words are getting twisted here.
So what I'd like to ask, please look at me, I'm speaking with you, but this is a pretty serious matter. I mean, I know you had a 6 o'clock flight, but we're going to change the Florida Constitution.
I will stay if that is your will. I have put my life into this because it is something that I feel very passionately about. I'm a volunteer. I'm not getting paid to do this. I probably work 80 hours a week on this.
If lawmakers intended to intimidate Frieden, their effort backfires.
It got me more committed to winning, and it got everybody who was supporting us more committed.
Frieden's reformers show voters how gerrymandering stacks the deck. They point to District 3, a weird-shaped congressional district that snakes 200 miles from Jacksonville to Orlando. By packing it with black voters, the Republican legislature gave Democrat Corinne Brown a super safe seat and shifted white voters into nearby districts.
That enabled Republicans to win the surrounding districts. It's called bleaching.
For a fix, other states like Arizona, Montana, and New Jersey use independent bipartisan commissions to draw election district maps. But Florida's Black and Latino leaders oppose that idea, and their support is vital to Frieden.
There's a kind of high level of mistrust for how these structures work. So, of course, people thought, well, why should I trust an independent panel that is going to be appointed by the elected officials that we're saying are not representative of who we are?
We were against that primarily because it didn't take it out of the political realm. It would have ultimately the impact of hurting minority folks' ability to elect candidates of their choice.
To get minority buy-in, Frieden offers legal protections and a radically new approach.
We made it unconstitutional for legislators to draw districts with intent to favor themselves or their party.
Frieden's coalition, spearheaded by Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, collects 1.5 million signatures to put its reform on the ballot. And with strong media backing, they build broad bipartisan support among voters.
The media's response to the Fair Districts movement was incredible. We had editorials from every single newspaper in the state, not only once, not only twice, but probably 5 or 6 times at every major juncture.
Come Election Day, Fair Districts Florida achieves the impossible. 3.1 million Floridians vote for gerrymander reform, a 62.9% supermajority. But Republicans who had fought reform also win big, piling up huge legislative supermajorities. Then in May 2011, the very same leaders who had savaged Ellen Frieden changed their tune.
We have a constitutional obligation to do this right, to make it the most open, transparent, and publicly participatory reapportionment process in Florida's history.
They promised to hold 26 public hearings and to put the whole process online.
And making sure that we give citizens the direct say, literally the ability to send in their plans so that we can draw the lines that best reflect the communities that we all represent. And so
it seemed too good to be true, and it was.
For proof, look no further than the state of Florida.
When the legislature unveils new district maps in February 2012, Ellen Frieden sees instantly that voters have been tricked. The new maps look a lot like the old ones, stacked to favor Republicans.
It was gerrymandering with disregard for the Fair Districts Amendment is what it was.
When I saw the Republicans' 2011 redistricting plan, I was disgusted. The Republicans were willing to take the chance of defying the Constitution because they had been behaving that way for decades before that.
The legislative leadership had put together this scheme where they were going to act like they were following the Fair Districts Amendments, when in fact the real maps, the real work on redistricting was being done behind closed doors by paid political operatives. It was a double game.
Making clear.
Orlando attorney David King, representing the League of Women Voters, goes to court to expose the double game. Lawmakers claiming they want maps from the public, but secretly getting their real maps from Republican campaign experts.
And so on a hunch, we subpoenaed a series of paid political Republican operatives. And what we got from this subpoena process was a treasure trove of maps and communications.
Give me how you got the breakthrough. I presume when you take depositions, take testimony from the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, they basically don't tell you a lot. But you got to have somebody spill the beans. Who spills the beans and how do you get that?
Well, it turns out one of the political operatives, Mr. Reichelderfer, was a hoarder. He kept all his stuff. He had it in his computer. His computer should be like on the National Register or something because it had like 150 maps.
Mark Reichelderfer was a professional consultant for the Florida Republican Party.
Sir, raise your right hand and be sworn, please.
And a longtime political pal and personal campaign manager for the Republican House Speaker.
Mark Reichelderfer's files were the smoking gun. We had emails coming from Speaker Cannon. We had emails coming to Mark Reichelderfer from other political operatives who were working at the Republican Party of Florida. Mark Reichelderfer was a hub of communications.
These operatives drew the maps, and then they found people in the community, in the Republican community, to actually file the maps with the legislature.
One unwitting fall guy was then 22-year-old Florida State University student Alex Posada, a former Republican Party intern. Congressional district maps were submitted without Posada's knowledge from an email address of his that he rarely used. Months later, under oath, Posada says he never submitted any maps. With computer sleuthing, attorney Fritz Wormuth traces the bogus Posada maps to a Florida Republican Party campaign official.
Oh, right by me. Here you go.
In court, the GOP official admits drawing and circulating district maps.
I shared my maps. I didn't put a patent or copyright on them. If someone thought they were good enough to be submitted, I'm certainly more than happy that they were submitted.
And we found that his maps had more districts that actually turned up in the final legislative maps than any of the others.
A circuit court judge finds the legislature engaged in conspiracy and illegal gerrymandering. The case goes to the Florida Supreme Court on appeal. The judge orders maps redrawn for 2 congressional districts. Lawmakers make such minor tweaks that reformers are totally frustrated.
We had to appeal to the Florida Supreme Court.
The High Court's ruling in July 2015 is a political earthquake. It rebukes the legislature for partisan gerrymandering with unconstitutional intent and orders 8 congressional districts redrawn. The state Senate then admits its maps were also illegal, and they're thrown out.
When I saw the Supreme Court's decision, I started trembling. It was a complete and total vindication of all we had been working for all these years.
The courts relied heavily on maps drawn by Fair Districts Florida, which had immediate impact in 2016. With more competitive districts, 5 congressional incumbents are ousted. Political newcomers win, like former Orlando Police Chief Val Demings and Rollins College professor Stephanie Murphy. And in 2018, reform brought more new winners.
The message is that our political system in this country can be fixed. And my answer to somebody who would complain would be, get out there and fix it.
If we can do it in Florida, you can do it in your own state.
I believe that we will win.
Energized by such victories in Connecticut, Washington State, North Carolina, California, and Florida, people all across the country sense a new day for grassroots civic action to revitalize American democracy.
We are seeing activism, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades. There is enormous opportunity to move reforms because people are hungry for concrete action they can take in this moment.
All right, there you have it. There you have it. Thank you. Let me just underline 2 or 3 points, then let's get into a dialogue here. Number one, people power does work. That woman in Seattle who says, I feel like I'm carrying on the American Revolution, every signature I get is a vote for the Constitution, we the people. She collected, did you get the number? 21,000 signatures, one person, to help put that on the ballot. Or you say, all right, we're not a ballot measure state. You look at Connecticut in that reform. There's a corruption scandal. A Republican governor wants to do a little step here, and the Democrats don't really want to do very much. It's public pressure that moves the legislature to make the reform. So the first thing is it does work. The second thing is it has a real impact. That Connecticut story is unbelievable. That African-American woman is telling you, I grew up in the poor part of Bridgeport. I had kids when I was young. She doesn't actually say whether they're in or out of wedlock. I was on food stamps. And she runs a nonprofit for African-American women who have breast cancer. She says, I wouldn't have thought of running for public office if it hadn't been for public funding in this state. She's now in her 4th term in the Connecticut Senate, and she is chair of the Legislative Committee on Health and Social Services. Now, can you imagine the impact of taking somebody with that background and having them be in charge of helping to frame those policies in the state? In the state of Florida, if you notice at the end, there's several people who changed seats and there are new faces coming along. They happen to be moving from Republican to Democrat, but that's not what matters. What matters is that more and more of the districts in that state are competitive. The whole point of gerrymander reform is not to move seats from one party to the other. It's to make all our votes count more. If you have a bunch of elections that are being won by 60 or 65 or 70 or 75%, it's a rational decision for a lot of young people in America today, and others as well, to say, my vote doesn't count, I'm not going to vote, I'm not going to bother. But if you have elections that are being won 52-48 or 51-49, or frustration of frustration for the media, we can't declare it on the night of the election, that's great, because it means the election is so tight that every single vote counts. That's where we want to be. We want to be in a political system where the competition is driving politicians to listen to voters, not the other way around. That's what we're after. That's what makes a difference. So when you see those seats shift, it's not which party they go to. It means some incumbent wasn't safe. And that's why, people talk about term limits. You want to get into it, we can't. Why do they say that? Because we want to get the people out. The difficulty with term limits is, if you've got a gerrymandered district and there's too much money going in the district, you just get the same person in office. They've got just a different name and a different face. Part of our problem in America today, I believe, is that we are focused on personality politics. If we can just elect the right person, if we can just elect, and now we're into the big race, we got 20 candidates for the Democratic nominee, and I don't mean to say that's not important, it is. But we have made a mistake here in assuming that the individual we can put in the White House or in the governor's chair or whatever it is, that one individual can make a difference. And the answer is the system is broken. Just imagine for a minute if Hillary Clinton had been elected. All right, we would have had 2 different Supreme Court justices, and that's very important. And we'd probably still be in the Paris Environmental Accord, and we probably would still be in the Iranian Nuclear Accord. But in terms of domestic policies, we probably wouldn't be much different. Maybe we wouldn't have had the tax cut. But we're still stuck on immigration. We're still stuck on health care. We're still stuck on issue after issue. We have to understand that we got to fix the system. And that's what's amazing. What's amazing and what's wonderful is that even you got it up here. I forgot to mention before when I was talking about 2018, Jesus next door to you. Excuse me, I shouldn't use that in this holy sanctuary. I should, amen, I shouldn't say that. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. But here you are. In North Dakota, you guys have to know about the badass grandmas of North Dakota, right? They're in the next state. It's a Republican woman and a Democratic woman, and they're old enough to be grandmas, and they got a bunch of them together, and they said, we want to clean up politics in North Dakota. Not exactly the most corrupt state you would have thought in the nation. And we want to cut foreign money out. We want to stop the power of lobbyists. We want to have disclosure of funding right away, online, immediately, and a bunch of other measures. No revolving door and that kind of stuff. And the politicians in North Dakota said, we don't need to clean up North Dakota. We got clean politics anyway. And the badass grandmothers in North Dakota said, not clean enough for us, friend. And they went out and they pushed for it. And they got it passed. And they passed an anti-corruption measure. I mean, those are the things that are happening around us. You saw one in South Dakota. I just mentioned one in North Dakota. Michigan, Ohio, Missouri. It's moving. It's moving. It's exciting. This American democracy is actually percolating from the bottom up. Let's go do it. All right, so what are your questions? What are your thoughts? Somebody must, yes, sir. I don't know if we can get a mic to you, but we got a runner coming right now.
I have a question based on your experience in travels around the country. Will the mass media support a constitutional amendment against Citizens United? Because there's a lot of money going to the mass media and campaigns. And I wrote a letter to the Star Tribune several years ago after the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court decision on Citizens United. It never got published, and I don't see too much opposition from the media about Citizens United. I'm pleased in your video about Florida media opposing gerrymandering, but I'm concerned about Citizens United.
It's a good question. It's a very important question. I don't think you're going to find the media pushing either for or against the reforms one way or another. You will find editorial pages. I think the most important thing at the moment is simply coverage. The media is really not, and it's hard for me to fully understand it myself, but when I talk to people in my profession or my career in Washington, and I'm talking to people who are 20, 30, 40 years younger than I am, they're very cynical about the working of democracy. And I really think a lot of the problem is they're sitting in Washington and they've been witnessing and living with the gridlock, the partisan gridlock, and the hyper-partisan rhetoric, the hatred that's going across party lines, and they've become very cynical themselves about what can happen. So I think you will find that there will be editorial writers. My hunch is there's one sitting in the room right now whom I just met a few minutes ago and who just introduced me, that would be writing on a number of these reform issues. And I'll bet there's some others in Minnesota as well besides Lori who do that. But I think basically the problem is inattention, not caring, not believing that people power matters. I mean, the attitudes that I was talking about before that the public has, that special interests have captured Congress, that corporations and billionaires dominate campaigns with their money. I think the media reporters themselves, the producers on television, have become so caught up in that, and they've repeated that so many times to themselves and to their audiences, they don't think the opposite can happen. That's why I went out and did this kind of reporting. And in many ways, I think the reporting is more important even than the editorial endorsement. Because when you start reporting it, people will say, hey, just what the guy says at the end there. Don't you love it when he says, if we can do it in Florida, you can do it in your state? I mean, that's a lot of what the media needs to do. But it's a tragedy, and it's not good work on the part of the media. I mean, I think it's a real serious problem. Great.
My concern with the amendment to say corporations are not people entitled to rights under the Constitution is that, first of all, there are corporations that, the press, etc., rely on the First Amendment free speech rights, and they are corporations.
Sure.
Secondly, there's the Fourth Amendment against unlawful seizures, the Fifth and 14th Amendments on due process of law that corporations are entitled to. If you say that corporations are not people, then they wouldn't be entitled to those protections against government seizures without due process of law.
Yep.
My concern with Citizens United is not that it does not prevent and did not invalidate direct contributions by corporations to individual candidates. It invalidated the prohibition on indirect contributions, which is all the 501c4s that you're talking about there. And that it changed the definition of corruption that had been in place to now require direct proof of, in effect, bribery, when in before it was any kind of influencing that was there. And Your Dark Money points that out, because in Montana, for example, they found that the independent no coordination requirement was being violated directly by these independent 501c4s that were conditioning giving money to the candidate unless they signed on to their entire agenda. That's corruption, but it's not bribery. And as a result, I think Citizens United needs to be challenged on the basis of corruption, not that a corporation is a person.
Well, you got about 6 questions or comments there all wrapped together. Let's see if we can thread them apart, okay? Number one, the proposal that has been passed in a number of states and the proposal that was advanced in the U.S. Senate and got a 54-42 vote was a proposal that basically restored the power of Congress and the states to regulate campaign finance. What the Citizens United decision did was effectively remove a century-old ban on corporate contributions to campaigns. The Tillman Act was, let me finish, okay? The Tillman Act was passed in 1907, and it banned corporate contributions to campaigns, and that stood from 1907 to 2010. So the most important thing that Citizens United did was to get rid of that ban, and the proposals in most states and the one in Congress is simply to restore the power of Congress and the states to regulate campaign finance. That's number one, okay? The second thing is, in terms of corporate money, what the ruling did was it said that corporations could spend from their own treasuries. And by the way, unions could as well. It wasn't just about corporations. But the spending by corporations is so much larger than unions. That's what's dominated public discussion. What corporations could do before was to set up political action committees to which executives in the corporation, members of the board, and employees could contribute, and then the political action committee could then give money to campaigns, okay? And what Citizens United did was said, we can take the stockholder money, we can take the money, the profits we've made, and we can toss a whole lot more money in, okay? Now, the next issue that you raised is the question of independent expenditures. Federal campaign law and most state campaign laws now put a limit on how much money any individual can give to any candidate directly. The way people get around it is they give it to a PAC, a political action committee, that is operating on behalf of that candidate, but is theoretically independent from that candidate. And almost nobody who goes and hears the Supreme Court hearings on those issues can understand how the Supreme Court can say it's independent when sometimes the former campaign manager, the brother-in-law, the cousin, whatever it is running this supposedly independent PAC. I mean, it's a game that is farcical. So there are ways in which we can restore some kind of order if we can get some intelligent decisions from the court. But the whole notion is, can we regulate campaign finance? That's the issue of Citizens United. Almost all the laws that I've seen drafted protect First Amendment rights for corporations as well as for others. The argument is, the argument among the advocates of reform is, should corporations have the same rights in political campaigns that they have in terms of their business communications, in terms of their advertising, in terms of reaching? Obviously, corporations as well as individuals need to communicate to do business. You can't take that right away from them. The question is there some way in which you can regulate campaign spending? As the woman says in the piece, we're not trying to regulate the First Amendment. We're just simply trying to put some limit on money in campaigns. That's what the object is here. That's what it's about. Okay? Yes?
Hi. I want to talk about the Electoral College a little bit, which gets a bum rap. In the Civil War period, Lincoln was not reelected as a Republican. He was reelected as a candidate of the National Union Party. And Johnson, the Democrat, was running for vice president. And it seems to me that we are in a very similar situation, just with the incredible amount of division. So what do you think about the idea of, first of all, working with Democrats to organize a national union coalition and to encourage Democratic candidates to say, we're at a time where we need to bridge this incredible division. We want to work with everyone, Democrats and Republicans, and we'll consider having a Republican as a vice presidential candidate. That's point one. But point two, if you take this approach, there's no reason why electoral tickets cannot be filed for elections in Republican states with electors who are pledged to vote for Pence. There is complete independence for electors. An elector can vote for anybody they want to. That's established in law. So what do you think about a national coalition, a national union coalition that advances a Democrat who's committed to work on a bipartisan basis to go after our division, and with an agreement that the Democrats are not going to file candidates in any, they're not going to file for that candidate in the states that they know they're going to lose anyway. They're going to promote an election of electors for Pence.
I think we got your question. There is an organization called No Labels. The whole point of, are you familiar with No Labels? Okay, the whole point of No Labels is that they're trying to get away from the parties, and they've been trying now for about 8 or 10 years to do exactly what you're talking about. That is to put together a national ticket in which you have a presidential candidate from one party and a vice presidential candidate from another party, in order to try to recreate, in effect, the center and to have a bipartisan approach. Their hope in 2012, and then more importantly in 2016, was to get Michael Bloomberg, the former Republican mayor of New York City, who has spent a good deal of money in various states on certain issues that are more backed by Democrats than by Republicans, so he has a kind of a bipartisan timber. He has a bipartisan connotation. Bloomberg thought about it and decided not to run it, and that has been the fate of that proposal for quite a while. You are not the first person to come up with it. A lot of people have tried to promote it, and it basically hasn't taken off. There's nothing that stops it legally from happening. It's just as a practical matter, it hasn't happened. I mean, the last time we had a really strong third-party candidate was Ross Perot in 1992, running against Bill Clinton and Papa Bush. Okay, and he got a significant chunk of the electorate. Bill Clinton was elected with a 43% popular vote minority. I mean, and so that was the closest we've come to having the kind of situation that you projected. And what happens is usually it comes out of a specific sense of frustration, and it comes usually with a particular candidate, and when they go try to do it the next time, it doesn't hold up. I mean, the difficulty, and part of this has to do with the way the campaign laws are written in the states. The states have laws that help reinforce the strength of the two-party system. And there are ways of opening that up. At Washington State, for example, and California and Louisiana have what's called a nonpartisan primary. They call it an open primary. It's a really open primary. Everybody runs in the same election. Everybody votes in the same election. The top two people then move on to the general election. And you can have two Republicans running against each other or two Democrats. And it has in Washington State, and it's starting to have in California, the effect of beginning to recreate the political middle in those states. Because the pressure in a unified nonpartisan primary is on both the candidates and their strategists. And the strategists are very important, because a lot of these professional strategists make their money by advising campaigns, and what they say is appeal to your base, get more extreme, get more radical, get more hyper-partisan. So you have to move the campaign strategists as well as the candidates to see that it's to their advantage to appeal across party lines. And that's happened in Washington State, and when you actually look at the voting records of the people from Washington State, 6 Democrats and 4 Republicans, none of them are in the outer 25% of their party in their voting records in Congress. So that, to me, is the most obvious strategy for recreating this bipartisan sentiment and moving people back towards the middle, rather than this two-party ticket that you're talking about. I mean, if I look at what's actually happened, that's where I see an actual result taking place.
Your point about dark money was so important, and the California experience was really educational. What do you think would be ideal remedies at both the state and the federal level in terms of changes in the law that would help avoid dark money? And then, based on your talking to people around the country, how much do you think people care anymore?
Well, those are good questions. Let me take the caring issue first. One of the issues that I find absolutely fires people up, practically everywhere I go, is the idea that there's a lot of out-of-state money coming in. Most of it is, in fact, dark money. I mean, people in Washington State, people in New Hampshire, people in North Carolina, people in Virginia, people everywhere I go, boy, they're angry at all that outside money coming in and affecting our elections. And 90% of that, if not 100%, is dark money. So that is an issue that has a real emotional punch, okay? The most significant thing, and it's very hard, we're putting a lot of information into these videos. It may have gone by you very fast. The most significant thing they did in California that is different from federal law and from most other state laws is they said they got rid of something that's very important. Federal law says if you're a political entity, you have to report your spending. If you're a nonprofit social welfare organization, think hospitals, think Boy Scouts, think church organizations, right? That's where it started. Well, the really smart political people back around 2008, 2009, and particularly after Citizens United 2010, back to that gentleman's question, they said, oh, we're going to set up a nonprofit. And we're going to be Americans for better, more responsible leadership. You just saw it up here. Citizens Center for Protect Patients' Rights. Americans for Job Justice. I mean, it tells you absolutely nothing about what they're about. We're going to do this, and we're going to be educational 501c3, and we're going to have a political arm, which is a 501c4. And we're going to qualify with the IRS for a tax exemption. Our donations all come in. And we don't have to reveal our donors under IRS rules. And the IRS has ruled that if you don't spend more than 50% of your money on politics, you don't have to report, you don't have to disclose, you can live under that. California said, baloney. California said, if you spend $50,000 in a California campaign, we don't care whether you're the Girl Scouts or the Sierra Club or the hospital or anybody, you must report. They cut right through this, and we're stuck totally on our federal system because there's no clear ruling, and there isn't anybody who covers politics today who doesn't believe most of those. They're called political nonprofits now in the journalism world. We call them political nonprofits. They claim to be social welfare organizations. It's clearly garbage. It happens on both sides. This is not one side or the other. And people do it on the left, on the right, pro-Republican, pro-Democrat, doesn't matter. And they all duck underneath it. There isn't anybody who covers politics who believes they only spend 50 or 49.9% of their money on politics. Chances are they're spending a lot more than that. But the IRS doesn't even bother to go after them. It's such a complicated problem. California just said, baloney. We're not going to get into whether you're political or not political. If you spend money in a campaign, you're political as far as we're concerned, you got to disclose. And every state would be better off. The federal system would be much better off if we just got rid of that old dodge and start opening up. I mean, we then have to go back and fix this business of phony independent expenditures, which are really tied to the campaign. I mean, Jeb Bush in the 2016 primaries, I mean, he had raised something like, his PAC had raised something like $110 million. And they were spending money for Jeb. I'm not picking on him. It just was an astounding amount of money. And they were spending the money for his campaign. In fact, he was even raising the money for that outfit before he became a candidate. Then the day he became a candidate, he stopped raising the money for it. But the whole rest of the family and everybody else went right on raising the money for it. I mean, it was absolutely baloney. And we're living with that. So we need to cut through some of the myths today. I mean, if you're spending money in a campaign, it doesn't matter what you are, you got to report. If it's going to be an independent expenditure, it's really got to be set up by people who really have nothing to do with the candidate or the candidate's family or the candidate's past campaign or the candidate's congressional office or the governor. I mean, you have no idea. These things are all woven together. So we could have much more intelligent rules. The answer is, just as I said to the guy in Connecticut, remember what I said to him? How did you persuade the politicians who are profiting from the current system, who don't actually want to see it change? How do you persuade them to change? Well, the only answer is you make it really uncomfortable for them by organizing people power, because they're not going to change. The answer is it's not being changed. The rules aren't being fixed because the politicians don't want to fix them. They complain, and the funders complain. But take a look at American government. People say the government doesn't work. My answer to that is government in America does work, not well enough in my opinion, and not for the right people. It works for the people who pay for it to work for them. It's working for the people who are putting the money in through systems like the ones I just described. We can see it, we can cut through that stuff if we want to do it. You could do, I mean, I don't know what the rules are here in Minnesota, but my hunch is they're not as tough as they are in California. Okay, they're bopping it around. You've got one over here.
Okay.
Great.
My question is about timing. Is there some clock ticking somewhere that if we don't get our act together, we lose?
We are losing, yes.
And
it's ticking right now.
And it seems to me that there's a cross between that clock and patience. I look at Florida, where to get the redistricting through, they had to go through the courts, and they had to go back to the courts. And now Florida has voted to re-enfranchise felons, but the government is trying to make that not work. And so the people who got that passed are probably going to have to go to the courts again. So how do we deal with that ticking clock?
Okay, they're wonderful questions. Wonderful questions. Thank you. Democracy is not a spectator sport. There is no end to the game. The game is going on. What happens is you have to remember that on the morning after the election, lobbyists go to work. Okay, so when you go to that felon rule that they passed in Florida, the people who are against that go to work the morning after the voters have voted. Voters think, we voted, it's done. And the people on the other side of the issue who are getting paid to work 52 weeks a year go to work. So the answer is, if you want to keep the reforms, number one, if you want to get the reforms, and number two, if you want to keep the reforms, you got to keep working. There is no end. It's not like a baseball season. It's not like a football game. It's not like any sports event. There is a moment when there's a decision, there's a vote, there's an election day, and the people decide. But the political battle for democratic institutions goes on. You have to understand that. That's part of what that little woman gets. Democracy, she says, you have to fight for it, otherwise it'll slip right through your hands. That's the answer. Okay, so there is no ending. You got to keep going. Is there a clock ticking? Yes, of course there's a clock ticking. What's going on is that whether you're looking at voting rights, whether you're looking at the influence of money in campaigns, and you saw the numbers going up on the money in campaigns, the effort to undermine and erode American democracy is going on continuously by people who are trying to expand their own power and influence within our system. And if we want it fair, we want it more open, we want it more inclusive, we want it more representative, then we got to commit ourselves to work on it just as hard as they are. And if we get organized, we can do it. It's not impossible. I mean, we shouldn't say, well, they're powerful and they're organized and they got that much money, we can't do anything about it. Because, in fact, I've showed you several examples, and there are many more where people have done that. But on time, yes, right now is a very important time. And not just because we're headed for another presidential election, but because we're headed for the 2020 census. The 2020 census will lead to a new redistricting and a reapportionment of all the seats in Congress and then of all the seats in state legislatures. It is a pregnant moment. And the difficulty is, if you don't get gerrymander reform, and you see it right in the state right near you, in Wisconsin, there was gerrymandering done by the Republican legislature there in 2011, and it's affected all the elections since then. So when there's a decision made and you get a gerrymander in 2011, it runs until 2021. So it isn't just that election cycle, it affects the next 5 election cycles. So that makes this particular cycle all the more important. And if you're going to get into ranked choice voting, if you're going to get into voter ID, if you're going to mobilize people and get them into turnouts, it makes these elections more important than the others have been before. They're all important, but the ones that come up at the time of the census are especially important. Yeah? Yes?
Hello, I'm Jean Massey. I'm the director at Fair Vote Minnesota, working on ranked choice voting. And first, I want to thank you for what you're doing. It couldn't be more important and more timely to showcase that we do have the power to fix our democracy. And to you, Lori Sturdevant, for helping to tell the story here in Minnesota. It's so critical. On the question of ranked choice voting, Maine began to pave the way with their election statewide. Your film predates their success.
Yeah, right.
Many of us hold the hope that it stands to change the structure of our elections to address the kind of gridlock that you're talking about in a structural and deep and permanent way. Can you speak more about that a little bit and what you see as the promise of ranked choice voting across the country?
Absolutely. I'm going to talk about ranked choice voting in an unusual way, because most people think about it, what can we do on the mayor's race and the city council races in our city, or what can we do about legislative races or the governor's race in our state? And I think that's very important, and my hunch is that's where it's going to happen first, because it's a new idea to a lot of people, and experimenting and trying and showing it is really important. But it's really important, believe it or not, in presidential elections. We've lost sight of something that's really important. We now have 48 states out of 50 that award all their electoral votes on the basis of the top vote getter in their state, not necessarily the one who gets a majority. 106 of Donald Trump's 322 electoral votes in 2016 came from states in which he did not win a majority. And by the way, the same thing was true of Hillary Clinton. The problem is, and it's interesting, I went back as a result of looking into that. I went back and actually looked at how it's actually the 12th Amendment to the Constitution which establishes the Electoral College that we have today. It isn't the Constitution itself. It didn't work very well, so they had to go back in and rework it. And when they went back in and reworked it, they talked about the need for getting a majority based on majorities. Now, they meant a majority of the electoral vote. They didn't mean a majority of the popular vote. But they assumed that there would be a majority in Connecticut. There would be a majority in New York. I'm going back to the original college. There would be a majority in South Carolina and Georgia and so forth. And what's happened over time is that with the rise of third and fourth parties, you now have somebody winning a state with 47% of the vote. So my question is, why don't we apply ranked choice voting to that? Why don't we say that when you go vote in an election, in a presidential election, you cast your vote for 1, 2, 3, 4. And then if the fourth person drops out, then the votes get reallocated, and the third person drops out, and they get reallocated, so that in the end, the decision to award the state's electoral votes is based on a majority. It's not based on a plurality. And it seems to me that's really fundamentally important. It's one of the reasons why we're now we've had 2 times now in the last 16 years, when we've had the popular vote winner lost the electoral college, or the electoral college picked the popular vote loser. Well, if you had ranked choice voting happening in the states, that would happen less often. We haven't tried it, so we don't know if it would work perfectly. But the odds are it would move much more to having those two systems match up. I mean, what we're looking for, it seems to me, we're trying to get back to what are the basics. So I said about gerrymander reform, the really important thing about gerrymander reform is to make everybody's vote matter more and to translate the vote into getting the representative you're trying to pick. Well, to me, that's what ranked choice voting is about. It's trying to get to a point where the ultimate winner is backed by a majority of the people rather than by a plurality. And we have state elections where people sometimes win the 37, 38, 41% of the vote. Leaves a lot of people uneasy that the majority of the people actually voted against the ultimate winner. So we need a system to we're looking for ways of restoring our connection between our people and our elected officials, and restoring confidence in our system that it's actually representing us. And the reason why there's many people here today and there's many people thinking about these issues around the country is there's just enormous disenchantment today with how our democracy is working. We don't believe this is the way it ought to work. We actually don't believe this is the way the founders intended. So I think ranked choice voting is just one of a package of 3 or 4 or 5 things that are really important.
I'm here. I'm next.
We'll get to you, sir. Have faith, we'll get to you.
I want to highlight what happened in Minnesota in 2012. And it took years of working. But I want to also highlight how important it is to get mad and get dedicated to making the change, and the importance of coalitions. And that was around the constitutional amendment to require a voter photo ID in order to vote. And we started out, we were a coalition of 60 groups around the state of Minnesota. And we were behind in the polls. It was 53%. Everybody thought, well, why shouldn't you show your driver's license? But they didn't realize the discrimination that was playing out by requiring that, and it's been mentioned before. And by hard work, by personal stories, I counted like 27 people that were in my circle of friends who probably could not vote under the new requirements. But we worked very hard, everybody did what they could, and we worked together, and we won.
Bravo. Bravo.
Here's another book about the topic, Democracy and Change by Nancy McLean.
Yep. Terrific book.
We've got a group going here. We want to make sure everybody reads it. So thanks for the time and thanks for bringing this important issue to us.
Thank you. Let me just deal with photo. I think we need to deal with the voter ID issue for a moment. I mean, almost every state has voter ID requirements. It's a question of us whether or not they are fair and they're accessible. In most states, I think 33 of the states now, maybe it's 34. You can show up and you have to, if you have a utility bill, if you have a bank statement, if you have any number of other documents that establish your name and your address, that's an effective form of ID. Where you have a real problem here is what this woman was talking about before, is laws that are deliberately stacked. I mean, the state of Texas, the state of North Carolina, the state of Alabama, if you have a hunting license or a gun license, your photo ID for a gun license and a hunting license qualifies. If you have you're a student at a university in the state, your university ID does not count, okay? That's what's really caused the problem. In your neighboring state of North Dakota, they have all different kinds of ID that are valid, including tribal ID. Now, Native American voter ID and voter registration is a very important issue in that state. But what people don't know is that the state law says that the ID that you have must have a street address. And almost all Native Americans living on reservations have a post office box or an RFD, and they don't have a street address. And so it sounds as though the system is fair and universal, but in fact, there are hookers written into the law that are designed to be difficult for certain populations, okay? So that's where we need to really zero in and understand that issue. There was somebody over here, gentlemen, yes.
Yeah, you alluded earlier to the political culture, particularly among young people, being cynical about...
Can you talk just a little louder?
You talked earlier, you alluded to the political culture, particularly of younger people not participating. Right. And my question is, because I believe culture eats strategy, probably heard that phrase, have the reforms that you talk about in the film and are talking about now, have they led to an increase in a change in the, have they created any change in the culture and the way candidates run campaigns, and have they increased voter participation?
Certainly the improvement of voter registration access has increased participation. In other words, states that have adopted systems of automatic registration, if you renew your driver's license or you interact with a state agency, same-day voter registration, yes, you can see evidence that there's an increase in voter participation when those take place. I can't honestly say that gerrymander reform or dark money exposure, I don't think I've seen any study that even attempts to try to answer that to see whether there's a link there. So I don't know. I want to go back. I must have said something about young people that I want to correct, because I think Yeah, I've got white hair, and a fair number of people in this room have white hair. And I think that among people of our generation, there is this thought that young people don't care about politics, don't get involved as much, and so forth. Their voting rate is much lower than the voting rate of people who are over 60, okay? But my experience when I deal with activist groups is that young people are very much involved, people from 18 to 35. They're very active. It depends what issues are being discussed. If you're talking at all about student debt, which is now running about 1.5 trillion, about $30,000 a head, it's a real hot issue. And if you want to get young people involved, that's one issue. If you're talking about a sense of tolerance, I mean, LGBT rights and so forth, young people are quite exercised about that. Certainly in a state like Colorado, I don't know what the situation is here in Minnesota, but when they put legalizing marijuana on the ballot, young people's participation went way up. But I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not young people see that the political system, the policy debates, and the way the system works is actually functioning and listening to them and addressing issues that they're concerned with, which is not actually unlike all the rest of us, to be truthful. I'm sorry there are not more young people here today, but I'm going down to Carleton College later next week, and we'll engage with them as much as we can. But if I said something about young people that made it sound as though they're not interested, they're not engaged, and so forth, that's not correct. I didn't mean to leave that impression. I want to correct that. It's a cultural issue for all of us. And obviously the people who are here today care about these issues a lot. But there are a lot of other people who aren't participating, who are waiting for or trying to find a way in which the people in the system, either the campaigns, the strategists, or the candidates, are actually reaching out to them and want to listen to them. And I mean, the perfect example of that is look what Bernie Sanders did on campuses all across the country in 2016. A man of 73 years old, he went around and he lit a prairie fire on all kinds of campuses all over the country. So, I mean, he was talking about our political culture and the political facts of life in America in a way they found authentic and credible. And I think that's true for anybody, but it's particularly true for young people. If they don't find it authentic, if they don't find it believable, then there's a tendency to say, pox on all their parties. And by the way, I mean, one evidence of that is you now have more than, I think it's under 30 years old, more than 50% of the people are not affiliated with either political party. It's by far the largest percentage of any age group in the country. And that's basically saying, we really don't trust the parties, we don't believe in them, we don't want to be part of that. And so I think it's our job in part to make it more credible, make it more receptive, and reach out to them. And listen. Listening's really important.
I've got one. I want to get your reaction to a recent program on National Public Radio. I think about a week ago, many of you probably heard it. It comes from Bridgewater, Connecticut, in fact, which was one of your subscriber cities. He's the head of the Bridgewater Assets. He and his wife gave $100 million to donate it to the public school districts in Connecticut. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in your reaction. Heath is a big statistics guy. That's how he made his money investing. And he made the comment, I think it was 14%. They asked him, what do you think the chances are today of our kids, which if we're in the middle class now, you hope your kids will make the middle class. That was kind of what was sold when I was growing up. 14%. His statistical analysis of the chances of our kids having a good opportunity to be in the future middle class. What do you think of that? And how does that fit in? He's working quite a bit on sort of what you're working on, and that is how to rehab the middle class. How does that fit into what you're getting at on the election?
Well, it's a good question. I don't think I buy the number, just to start with, but there's no question that our claim to be the land of opportunity, that is a country where you can go from the bottom to the top, or you can go from the bottom to the middle to the top, is nowhere near as good as it was 30 years ago. There are all kinds of good studies out that will tell you that it is easier for kids to rise from the middle to the top or the bottom to the middle in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, in Australia, in Canada, and probably 2 or 3 other countries that I've forgotten. But there are at least 8 or 9 that are now, it's called upwardly mobile. They're more upwardly mobile. That is, the potential for rising is better. I forget the number, but I think it was about, there was a poll done about a year ago about how young men at age 40 were doing compared to where their fathers were at age 40, about 30 years ago. And I think more than half were not in the same state in terms of their earnings, their job perspectives, and their lifetime trajectories. Difficult things to put together. So whether or not it's 14% or not, I don't think is really the critical issue. There's no question that the problem of being able to move upward in this society is a serious problem that we didn't used to have 30 or 40 years ago. And what is clear, and by the way, I mean, if you want to go look at the election of 2016, the earmarks are all over that election. Our elections are normally right-left elections. Progressive, conservative, Republican, Democrat. They are across a horizontal scale from left to right. The 2016 election, and remember, every presidential election is 3 elections. It's not 1 election. It's 2 primaries, a primary in each party, and then a general election, okay? The 2 elections in the 2 parties were bottom-up elections. Donald Trump's success in the Republican primary was a success built on the anger of middle-class people and rural people feeling they had been betrayed by the Republican establishment, by the corporate elite. And Bernie Sanders nearly winning, I mean, going from nowhere to nearly knocking off a dead ringer, absolute certain nominee Hillary Clinton, was also based on his basically saying, this is no longer a fair society, it's not equal, it's Wall Street dominating things. So you have in both parties, you have a revolution from below. It's still there. It's still there. We have not resolved that issue. Inequality today in America is worse than it was when I wrote about it in 2012. So that is a critical issue, and it's an issue we're going to have to grapple with in this country. And if you spend any time talking to blue-collar people, or even people in the lower end of the tech sector, the kind of people who do your EKG when you go to get a medical test, the kind of people who do the drafting in engineering firms, the kind of people who are repairing cars when you take your car into your car dealer. I mean, there's a whole slew of people we have who need more than a high school education, who don't necessarily need a BA or a BS. They've probably got some kind of either in college or in job training that's raised them to a skill level that is above high school. Those people are scared stiff about their financial future, whether or not they're going to have enough money to retire on, whether or not their kids are going to do as well as they can, whether or not they can continue to afford the house that they have. And the wives and their husbands are working 2 jobs, 3 jobs, 4 jobs. I mean, we have a really serious problem there that we haven't addressed. That's what actually got me into all this. I wrote the book, Who Stole the American Dream, about what had happened to the middle class. And as I got into it further and further, I realized we weren't going to tackle that as an economic and social problem until we could get a political system that was responsive to us as people, which is what's moved me to talk about this. But that's the issue I want to get back to. That and climate change, if we can get the political system functioning. I mean, that's a really important question. And it doesn't matter whether the numbers are exactly what he said or not. He's right about the problem. It's a serious, serious problem for this country. I think I've just about worn you guys out.
One more question.
There's somebody back there.
Thank you. Ranked choice voting for the president. There's a book, 2018, The Electoral College, which has a formal proposal for ranked choice voting for president if there's a constitutional amendment. That constitutional amendment does not currently have ranked there are resolutions now pending in both the House and the Senate. They don't have ranked choice voting as an option. So I think those should be amended to say Congress shall have the power to institute ranked choice voting. So that's for the current. Now back to history. I've been studying and writing about electoral college reform ever since the Strib 3 years ago, published a long counterpoint that I proposed, and now they just did it again. But I have not seen anywhere in that the point that some form of ranked choice voting was actually adopted in the Constitution in 1787. Madison and Hamilton were really terrified by the idea that you would not get a majority in the Electoral College, and then you would have your contingent election back in the House, which was totally undemocratic, and which they absolutely hated. So what they came up with is one voter, two votes. People can vote for their favorite son, which they expected a lot of electors would do, but then they could also vote for the person of a greater, somebody who would represent the interests of the nation as a whole. And your second choice voter, as Madison pointed out, would likely become the president. That's a much simpler form than the formal ranked choice voting approach. But I think if you've got two votes out there, if every voter gets two votes, it's going to be hard for a candidate to run a really nasty, super partisan campaign where that candidate is unlikely to get the second place votes that they might otherwise appeal to. So I think if you're talking about national popular vote, and you want a system that you might be able to implement nationwide without all the technicalities you need, all the sort of the hardware you need to go through that multiple process in your ranked choice voting, going back to what they did in 1787 might be a good approach.
Just in terms of the national popular vote, there are now 14 states and the District of Columbia that have committed themselves legally, that is by a vote of their state legislature, to cast their electoral votes for the winner of the national popular vote, regardless of the outcome in their states. To be effective, you need enough states that have 270 electoral votes, which is a majority of the 538 electoral votes that are cast every presidential election. At the moment, those 14 states and the District of Columbia have amassed 189 out of 270, so they're 70% of the way there. And there are two other states, Oregon and Nevada, that are currently in the process, that it's passed one house of the legislature and not the other. And if they are added, that's 13 more electoral votes, and it will be 202, which means they need 68 more. Some people say this will be challenged in the courts if it passes, but it has moved enormously fast. First in the wake of the election in which Al Gore won the popular vote but lost the presidency, and second in the race in which Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the presidency. So these last two elections, one in 2000, one in 2016, have hastened the process. My point here is not whether or not this is a good solution or not. My point is that people are exercised about the ineffectiveness of the way our system is working, and they're actually taking action on one front after another. So grab hold. There was one other person that had their hand up. I don't want to cut them off, but otherwise I'm going to read an announcement that I was asked. Yes? I still follow Russia a lot, yes. There's absolutely no question that we should be paying a great deal of attention to the risk of the integrity of our 2020 election because of not only what the Russians are doing, the North Koreans, the Chinese, and others, but the Russians foremost among them. It's absolutely clear that the people in Donald Trump's own administration in the intelligence services, particularly Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence, are saying every state has got to have a system of paper ballots along with its system of electronic ballots because you need to have some way of verifying the vote. And there's probably not adequate funding that has been voted either by Congress or by the states in probably 15 states at least. Most states, I don't know about Minnesota, but I would assume Minnesota's done something along these lines. But there are a bunch of states that have not. And the real worry is that in rural areas, there's likely to be less cyber defense taken care of and spent on than in, I mean, if you compare upstate New York or hilly mountain parts of California to Los Angeles has got the money to do better protection. So yeah, I think it's something we have to be very concerned about. And there's absolutely no question that Putin regards this as an element of national strategy. I mean, Putin is out to weaken NATO. He's out to get people to doubt the value of democracy, to question whether or not democracy works. He's out to set people at odds to each other. It's clear that's a strategy that's underway and that we have to pay attention to and devote some effort and resources to fighting.
And I think young people are victims of the online targeted messages.
Well, we're all victims to online. The danger is that people who know how to do this are very sophisticated and they hide their tracks very well. I just want to say, if you think anybody else that you know might be interested in seeing this documentary, it is up on YouTube. You can find it on YouTube at a YouTube channel called The People versus the Politicians. The People vs. the Politicians. Please spread the word if you think it was valuable. Particularly tell younger people about it, children and grandchildren and friends and neighbors. And then I'm asked to say, by Clean Elections Minnesota and American Promise Minnesota, my hosts, who I want to thank again, to ask you to stop by the desk as you leave to pick up information about what they're doing and find out how to help, these are their words, how to help move these reforms forward in your community, in the state and nationally. Remember, we're a self-governing nation. It's up to us. If you go to my website called reclaimtheamericandream.org, the first headline you will see below the landing page is, "It's up to us." Thank you very much. Thank you, John.